With that, we know about the URI and the HTTP method parts of the contract. Time to talk about the last part, the payload. When we think about RESTful APIs these days, we often think of JSON. But as we learned, JSON has nothing to do with REST per se. It just happens to be the most often used resource representation format these days. That implies that a RESTful API can also work with other representation formats, like XML or a proprietary format. So that also means that we have to be able to let our API know what format we want to get back. And that brings us to one of the key concepts when building APIs, content negotiation. This is the process of selecting the best representation for a given response when there are multiple representations available. And it's important. If we're only building an API for one specific client app, it might be okay to always get back representations in JSON. But if we're building an API for consumption by multiple clients, some of which you have no control over, chances are that not all of these can easily consume JSON in a response. Some might be better off with XML or another format. So how is this done? Well, that's what the accept header of the HTTP request message is for. An API consumer should pass in the requested media type as value, like application JSON or application XML or something else. For example, if the accept header has a value of application JSON, the consumer states that if the API supports application JSON, it must return that. If it has a value of application XML, it should return an XML representation, and so on. But what if no accept header is available? Or if one is sent, but the requested format is not supported by the API? Well, a lot of APIs simply default to a default format, typically JSON. But especially in the second case, I would suggest to avoid that. We could argue that we'll allow our API to serve up responses for requests without an accept header with a default representation. In principle, in REST, an accept header must always be included. But in this case, we could say that we're taking a pragmatic approach. However, when the client requests a specific format, that means the client also expects to get something back that the client can parse. If the API returns the default format if the requested format is missing, we'd likely end up with a client that cannot parse the response anyway. So in those cases, a 406 not acceptable status code is warranted. After all, that is what that code was made for. Okay, so how do we do that then in ASP.NET Core? This is all about output, the format of our resource representation. ASP.NET Core supports this through output formatters. The consumer of the API can request a specific type of output by setting the accept header to the requested media type, like application JSON. But if there's output, there's also input. We are running a bit ahead of ourselves with that. We haven't looked at providing input yet. But this does seem like a good place to mention this already, because next to output formatters, ASP.NET Core also supports input formatters. And that deals with input. For example, the body of a post request for creating a new resource. For input, the media type of the request body is identified through the content type header. In both of these cases, we're talking about HTTP request message. An HTTP response message can also contain a content type header to identify the media type of the response body. These types of headers can be seen as part of the self-descriptive message constraint, which states that each message must contain enough information to process it. In case of the accept header, it tells the API what format to return. In other words, how to process the message and return a response. While the content type header will tell the API the format it will have to parse the body to be able to process the message. Let's support an additional output format, XML.